Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, providing more than 41,000 jobs in the production of wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details at choosewood.com.
Welcome to St. Louis on the Air. I'm Don Marsh. Today we're talking with author-historian Carol Fearing Shepley. She has updated her best-selling book, St. Louis, An Illustrated Timeline, in which she touches all the important historical bases. Carol Shepley joins me in studio. Nice to see you again.
Well, nice to see you, too.
It's been a few years since the original version of this book came out. 4 years, I guess.
4
it's
years,
been. Oh, wow.
Because it was the 250th anniversary.
That's right, exactly. Well, how much updating have you been able to do in the 4 years?
Well, it's a whole 40 more pages, but they're not as many pictures, so it's a lot more updating. Mm-hmm. It's like 50 pages of the old book.
It's a very, very handsome book and very heavy, too, for some reason. It must weigh 5 pounds.
And intellectually heavy, too.
Yeah, of course,
yes.
Of course, it goes without saying. I'm surprised that there are fewer pictures and less artwork in this one. It seems crammed full of it.
Oh, well, there are fewer pictures in the new part, because...
Oh, I see.
Yes.
Well, what specifically did you feel you needed to update?
Well, most specifically, when I completed work on the first edition, it was the end of August 2014, and Michael Brown was killed August 9th. And so I mentioned Ferguson, but that was what I really wanted to wrap my mind around. I wanted to read everything I could and come to some conclusions. And also, I did some wonderful new research about the World's Fair. I found tons of new material.
Is there anything that we don't already know about the World's Fair?
Oh, I think so.
Really? Such as?
Well, of course, we know that it was a collaboration of everybody in town and that David Roland Francis got it all going. It wouldn't have happened without him. And, of course, the mayor, Rolla Wells, who made sure the streets were clean and the garbage was collected, got rid of the corrupt city boss who was messing that stuff up and made the water pure. But every single person in town put in their effort to planting specific flowers out in front and sweeping their streets. And most especially, some of the most fun things I found were about the primitive peoples, the anthropological exhibit. Some of those were kind of upsetting. And then all the new and modern things that the electric plug, that was the first time anybody saw an electric plug.
And electric lighting in and of itself was a big deal at the fair. Let's go back to those indigenous groups, though, because that, particularly today, people look back on that and say, what the heck were we thinking? That was totally exploited.
It seems just horrible that they brought in people from Africa, from South America, the Philippines. They had, 90 acres of people's habitats. And the fairgoers went and looked at them as though they were animals in the zoo. Yet William Marion Reedy at the end said, I've learned that these people have so much to offer, and we can learn from them. So it did ennoble them in some ways, too.
Explain who Mr. Reedy was, because your publisher is also named Reedy.
Yeah, it's Reedy Press. And when I first met Josh Stevens, I said, is this named after William Marion Reedy? And then I knew we had a meeting of the minds. He was in the 1890s, he became the publisher of The Mirror, which was one of the premier literary journals in the United States. Its circulation was larger than the Atlantic at the time. And he discovered, well, of course, he discovered Sarah Teasdale. She was here, but also Ezra Pound. He was one of the first people to discover Emily Dickinson. I mean, that's what kind of a tastemaker he was.
And Josh Stevens, the owner of Reedy Press, named it Reedy in a tribute to this particular gentleman.
Absolutely.
Your first book was a victim of that fire that Reedy suffered.
Yes.
That was a disaster, wasn't it?
Yes, it's just about a year ago. Their whole warehouse went up. You could see the smoke from 90 miles away, and I lost all my books. It's very painful to think about still. And they lost 200,000 books. And
200,000.
200,000.
I had never seen that figure
Yes.
before. Well, that, I guess, was one of the reasons why this second edition has been published.
Yes. In December, we did a benefit for reading. A lot of the authors did. In the Duck Room, Joe Edwards offered that for us. And then in January, Josh called and said, would you like to do a second edition? And I just jumped at the chance because I'd been doing research just because that's what I like to do.
Well, you've got another fundraiser coming up, I see here. Is it this Thursday?
Yes,
Thursday night?
yes. And NPR is part of it, too.
Yeah, and what are the funds being raised for?
Actually, I don't know. I guess for Reedy Press,
Well, it's at the Athletic Club, Missouri Athletic Club.
It's a Missouri Athletic Club, and it's going to be like the Moth Radio Hour. 5 Reedy authors plus what's his name? Calvin Riley, who's the director of the George Vashon Museum, will be all telling stories. He's also a poet.
That's at 7 o'clock at the MAC, I see here. And it also says the proceeds will be going to Missouri Athletic Club charity. So
that's
so
great.
that-
I'm
that's
glad.
it,
Oh,
yeah.
I'm glad.
Yeah. Okay, let's go back to the book. And I'd like to return to Ferguson. What sort of conclusions and opinions and editorial comment do you have with regard to Ferguson in the book?
I spent 3 months reading every single newspaper, every book I could find that was published about it. And I believe this was something that was going to happen somewhere in the United States. I mean, this is a situation that exists. There's real problems between African Americans and white police officers. And there, as Al Sharpton said, Ferguson has pulled the Band-Aid off racism in America.
Didn't end it by any stretch. They had the police confrontations.
But I also feel it's very unfair that Ferguson has this reputation because Ferguson was a successfully integrated community. The New York Times said it's part of a ring of rage around St. Louis. That's just not true. And even Michael Brown, as we now know, he appeared this model citizen in early reports, but he certainly, had done some things wrong himself there.
I guess what it really exposed was what the social structure was in Ferguson and other places where people were being pulled over driving while black, and they were being basically put in debtor's prison because they couldn't pay fines and that sort of thing.
Yes. Yeah. That's the worst part. Yes, and that had they are remedying that. They began almost immediately working on that because of the Department of Justice consent decree.
Yeah. So what else is new in the book?
Well, there are several people that I had left out, really important people. Dave Stewart, Gio Obata, Ted Jones. There are new people like that. There's new information about the founding of St. Louis, and then, of course, all this new information about the World's Fair.
Yeah. I went through the book, and as I like to do, is get as much of it, digest as much of it as possible, as I'm trying to say. And one of the things that kind of caught my eye were some obscure women, very, very important to the history, but we don't know much about them. You can tell us a little bit now. How about Susan Minor?
Virginia Minor?
I thought it was Susan Minor, attempted to vote in 1872.
Yeah, that's Virginia Minor.
Yeah, well,
right.
Another mistake.
You got mixed up with Susan B. Anthony. That's why.
Maybe.
Because she was as important as Susan B. Anthony at the time. She came to St. Louis from Virginia, and she married her cousin, so therefore she got to keep her name, just like the feminist of the day. And she became active in civic affairs during the Civil War. But it was afterwards, the year after, when her only son, who was 13 years old, was shot and killed in a hunting accident, that she was galvanized to make her life make a difference for the people of the world. And she believed that women were citizens too, but they were not enjoying the rights of citizenship unless they could vote. So she marched up and attempted to vote in the election of Grant v. Greeley in 1872. And of course, she was refused. And then she studied law, and her husband was a lawyer, and they took a case clear to the Supreme Court, where they lost in a unanimous decision.
She was about 50 years too early with, with all of it. And the suffragists were also active here 50 years later.
Thanks to Virginia Minor and her Missouri Women's Suffrage Association, Missouri had some of the most liberal laws in the country for women. And then the suffrage movement was incredibly active here with Edna Gellhorn, and people of this stature who also had national reputations. Who, in fact, they came up with the Walkless, Talkless Parade, a nonviolent demonstration when the Democratic Convention was held here in
1916.
Yes, 1916. And they wore the yellow sashes, which became the color for the women's movement throughout the world.
How about Adeline Cozzens?
Adeline Cozzens was someone who was active in the Civil War, and her daughter, she became a nurse and actually got a pension. She fought to get a pension because women didn't get pensions. Nursing was something you volunteered. And her daughter was one of the first women who passed the bar exam.
Was she kind of like a nurse? Is that what she was doing in the battlefield?
Yes.
Because I think she took a bullet in the leg, didn't she?
Yes. Yeah.
And the pension was $30 a month?
Yeah, right.
Times
Yes. And she had to
change.
fight for it.
Another name that is more familiar to people here in St. Louis would be Annie Malone. I'm not sure. We know about the parade and the building that carries her name, the institution that carries her name, but most people don't know that she was a very, very wealthy woman.
Very wealthy woman and a fantastic businesswoman. She was the youngest of 10. I mean, she was born in Metropolis, Illinois, just like Superman. And her parents died early, and she helped her older sisters fix their hair. And she was really good in chemistry. And she thought, black women really want to work on their hair. This is important. So she developed these great formulas. And she came to St. Louis in 1903 because she knew that the World's Fair was going to bring a lot of people here. And she empowered women because she wanted them to be able to earn money the way she could and be independent. So she taught them to go around. Well, she taught them the skills to manufacture these hair products and to use them on women, and also to be saleswomen and go door to door and sell these products.
And she became a multimillionaire in the process.
Multimillionaire, one of the wealthiest women in Missouri.
Yeah, that's a great story. We have to take a break. I'm talking with Carol Shepley about her new book, St. Louis, An Illustrated Timeline. We'll come back and continue this conversation in just a moment. Stay with us. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio 90.7 KWMU.
Thank you for listening to this St. Louis on the Air podcast supported by University College at Washington University, with undergraduate and graduate programs part-time, evening, and online. University College at Washington University, offering world-class education within reach.
Welcome back as we continue our conversation with historian Carol Shepley. Who are some of the others, and I hope it's not unfair to ask you of you this way, who are some of the other obscure but important people that you've included?
Obscure?
Well,
they're not
well-known.
obscure to me. Yes. So
well, they are to most people, though.
That's true.
Such as the women we just mentioned.
Yeah,
Are there others that fall into that category?
The women were a big theme for me, and also African Americans, because I believe, that makes up the texture of St. Louis, not just all white males. Well, let's start early. Well, very early. Louis Saint-Ange de Bellerive really was so important to setting St. Louis on its path. He was a Frenchman who brought he was the military commandant, and he brought a judge, and we had civil law and contracts. And then another Frenchman was Jacques Clémorgan, who was a fur trader, and he never married, but he had a black concubine, and he had 4 mixed-race children, and he tried to leave his estate to them, and that was against the law. That was not acceptable.
Well, I'm sure there are others, but it's unfair. With all that you've got in that book, it's unfair to try to have to draw these out. But let's talk about a couple of people that are better known that are also included in your book. Charles Dickens, for instance, not very flattering about St. Louis.
No, except he was flattered. He didn't think much of St. Louis as kind of muddy, dirty place, but he really respected William Greenleaf Eliot, who was T.S. Eliot's grandfather and the moral conscience of the city and really a moral conscience for the whole United States.
What was Dickens doing in St. Louis?
Oh, he was on a speaking tour of the whole country.
He seemed to favor Cincinnati, as I recall from the book.
Shame on him. Yes.
Mark Twain lived here. Now, I never knew that. We always associate Mark Twain with Hannibal, and of course, I guess it was Connecticut where he wound up eventually.
Right, yes.
But how long did he live here, and why?
He was, I'm not sure exactly how long. It was maybe 5 or 6 years, and he was based here when he was a steamboat captain. He came to live with his sister. It looks like Pamela, but it's actually pronounced Pamela Moffett, and her husband got Twain his pilot's license, and then he, went up and down the river, and he said, I could have bought the city for $10,000, and it's the shame of my life I didn't.
He came back years later, I guess, as part of his writing research.
Yes, many times. Well, when he did Life on the Mississippi, and he got an honorary degree from the University of Missouri and so forth.
So we can claim a little bit of Mark Twain,
yes.
too, no question about it. All right, we talked about this yesterday when we were discussing St. Louis Civil War history. And a lot of people, I think, were surprised to learn that Robert E. Lee spent 2 tours of duty in St. Louis. What was he up to?
Yeah, so he was here at Jefferson Barracks, and he was really a very accomplished, civil engineer. And what was happening, which would have been terrible for St. Louis, was the currents were taking the Mississippi River. An island was building up, and they were taking the Mississippi River, moving our shore over to, far, far from the city. So he devised the methods to reroute the river so that we still had a waterfront, which was pretty important.
The Army Corps of Engineers. That was his.
Exactly.
That was his assignment. And then later on, he was at Jefferson Barracks. Something that we learned yesterday. We've got a caller who wants to get into this conversation. Let's bring him in. It's Eric calling from St. Louis. Eric, thank you for calling us. You're on the air.
Sure. Hey, I was curious if the author knew about. There was a lawyer who lived in Lafayette Square, and he lived in a house that was destroyed by the tornado of 1896 with a big turret on it facing the park. But I understand that he was very influential in helping St. Louis, I should say the state of Missouri, side with the North during the Civil War, and my understanding is he's representative of a lot of the German people who came over escaping oppression in Germany during the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, and who were very free-thinking, very liberal-minded, and were very appalled by racism, and so due to influence of people like this, that's why Missouri went from being a slave state before the war to being on the other side with the Union during the war.
Yes, definitely. The German population is one of the prime reasons that Missouri stayed in the Union. They left Germany because of the revolutions of 1848. They were fleeing oppression, and they did not want to see slavery. There was a lot of prejudice against them. They were called the Huns. And who is the lawyer? Was this Montgomery Blair? Or?
No, he lived on the other side of the park. This guy lived at the corner of it's not an apartment building. The house is no longer there. I remember reading about him in a history of Lafayette Square. I got the book at the Bar Branch Library, and there's a little whole story about him. And there's a picture of his house and a picture of him, and it was quite interesting, but I forget his name.
Huh.
Interesting stuff.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah, the Germans certainly made their mark here, but so did the Italians and so did the Irish. A lot of them came in at the same time in the middle of the 19th century, didn't they?
Right. The Irish came just after the Germans because of the potato famines, and the Italians came a little later in another wave at the end of closer to the end of the century.
Do we have any sense as to how well these groups, I mean, they came in large numbers, how well they got along?
Well, not so well. Generally, people stay with their own kind, and they kind of look down on each other for different reasons.
Well, we can, to this day, we can see certain neighborhoods where it's predominantly Italian, for instance, such as the Hill, and other places where there were certainly large German populations. Is there a most important St. Louis in all of your research? Does someone just jump out as being probably the singular person?
Well, I guess. Of all the people who made this city what it is, well, there are three I can think of, and one is still alive, which is interesting. Well, of course, I mentioned William Greenleaf Eliot. I mean, he was the conscience of the city. He came as a minister, but it's for education that we know him. He founded Washington University. He believed women should be educated to the same degree as men. So he also founded Mary Institute so they could be trained to matriculate at the university level. He also, during 1849, when there was a cholera epidemic and the Great Fire, he was so persuasive about the civilizing values of education that he persuaded the populace to vote for a bond issue that meant St. Louis had some of the best high schools in the public schools in the country. And when we stayed with the Union, he believed it was because people could read and they understood what is at stake. And then in the early 20th century, we had another great leading light, Luther Ely Smith. And there's a Luther Ely Smith Square that's between, I know between the courthouse and the arch. And so he was actually born in Chicago, and he came to law school here and married a St. Louis woman, and that he could never leave again. But he was involved first in the playground movement. He went to serve in World War I when he was 40 years old. He founded the Muni Opera. He brought Harlan Bartholomew here, the first city planner, civil engineer in the United States that a city had on staff. And then, of course, he was the one who had the vision and saw it through that we had to have a monument to westward expansion. Mm-hmm. And then the final one is William Danforth, who started out as first the vice chancellor of the medical school, then the chancellor of Washington University. Then when he retired, he just felt the voluntary school transfer system was just an excellent thing to really improve education and to improve the prospects of black children in the city to go to go to county schools. He found that they graduated 50% as compared to 16. Then he founded the Danforth Center, and then he was instrumental in founding Cortex.
What happened to St. Louis? We were on top of the heap at one time, and everybody says Chicago overtook us in the early part of the 20th century. What happened here?
Well, one thing, with Chicago, at the time, in 1856, the population of St. Louis was twice that of Chicago. But what happened was the Rock Island Bridge. In the northern part of the United States, the Mississippi River, crossing it with a bridge is just, no big deal. Mm-hmm. But that meant that all the railroad traffic went from the East Coast through Chicago to the West Coast, which that bypassed us. But I also believe that the separation of the city and the county is another big problem because we are competing with each other, not working together. And that was 1876.
And the fragmentation issue. Our time is beginning to wind down, but I wanted to end our discussion talking a little bit about music because that's going to be our next segment. we certainly have a prominent role in the world of American music, don't we?
Yes, we do. You know, with Miles Davis, the St. Louis Blues, William C. Handy, and also our symphony is the second oldest symphony in the United States.
We were influenced.
Nelly, you know.
Well, sure, and I continue
It
to
continues, right?
Yeah,
right,
yeah.
right.
And I guess a lot of that was because of the migration from the South and from New Orleans in particular, where a lot of this got started.
Right, right. We went all up and down the Mississippi River.
Is there a favorite part of this book for you? I know that you said you were putting a lot of emphasis on women, but is there anything that you really enjoyed writing about most?
Well, I put a lot of emphasis on women, and I also put a lot of emphasis on cultural history. I put artists and authors, these aren't generally in a history, but I feel that's what makes a city really real and vibrant. And I put a lot of quotes from each author about St. Louis, so that gives a real sense of the texture.
A lot of people say that St. Louis has an inferiority complex. Do you think so?
Oh, I really do. And one of the things I love is when I give my talks, people often say, "Oh, you make me feel so good about living in St. Louis," because this is a wonderful place.
Well, this is a wonderful book. It's a great way to relive, if you will, the history of this community. And it's, as I said earlier, a very handsome book. It's very heavy, and it's very detailed in a nice way. So, Carol Shepley, thank you so much for being with us. It's always a pleasure talking to you. We'll look forward to the next one.
Thanks.
Right?
You always make me think. I like being interviewed by you.
and I like talking to you. Thank you. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio 90.7 KWMU.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association. Missouri produces wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details on the variety of products made in the state are at choosewood.com.